Hello, friends, and let's get started.
Imagine you love your wife so much so that you are willing to listen to her even when she talks about nothing. So much so that you don't need space from her because she's your home. You think you have the perfect marriage. But one day you notice something strange. She still smiles at you the same way, but there's something new in her gaze, a distance, a doubt. She starts asking strange questions. At first you don't pay attention, but then one day, deep down, you realize something has changed. You don't know what it means. But one thing is clear. The woman you love is drifting away. And the worst part is, there's nothing you can do about it. But before we get to that story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new exciting stories. Julia's life resembled a carefully constructed masterpiece. Her marriage to Brandon was like the crown of this beautiful picture. From the outside, it looked like everything was perfect. Brandon idolized her, surrounded her with care, which at times even seemed excessive. He took a tireless interest in her day, listened patiently even when she didn't feel she deserved such attention. But deep inside, Julia was troubled by something. It wasn't dissatisfaction with her husband or their life together. It was more a sense of something elusive, subtle. One day, her friend Zara started a conversation about self-discovery outside of marriage. Julia had laughed at first, dismissing the idea as absurd. "It's absurd," she said, taking a sip of her latte. But Zara didn't smile back. "Are you sure? Think about it, Julia. You're a wonderful wife. But has it never occurred to you that there's more to you than just being a wife? It's not about Brandon, it's about you. It's that you can find yourself again." Julia only brushed it off, but Zara's words stuck in her head. That night, when Brandon had fallen asleep peacefully beside her with his arms around her waist, she'd lain open-mouthed, staring at the ceiling. What if Zara was right? What if she really was missing something important? Thoughts of that didn't leave her for the next few days. Her friend's words kept running through her mind, making her look at her husband differently. Julia began to notice the smallest details. The way he folded his napkin neatly after dinner. The way he sighed quietly with a satisfied look while reading his favorite book. She still loved him, but at the same time the fire of curiosity that had been awakened by Zara's confidence was growing in her. One sunny afternoon, they met again at a cafe. Zara didn't beat around the bush. "You've thought about it, haven't you?" she asked, smiling slyly. Julia swirled the cappuccino cup in her hands. "I don't know. It doesn't seem right, Zara. Brandon is so good to me. I can't just—" Zara leaned closer, interrupting her. "Do you really think Brandon would want you to live your whole life with regrets? Love isn't about control. It's about trust. He'll understand. He loves you." The words came over Julia like a powerful wave, sweeping away any vestiges of resistance. She didn't respond immediately, letting the thoughts settle in her mind. Zara leaned back in her chair, sipping her coffee with the look of someone who already knew the outcome of the conversation. Julia continued to mull over what had been said, her mind torn between doubt and longing to know what lay beyond the boundaries of her familiar world. One evening, while Brandon was at the store, she wandered through the house that had once seemed cozy but now pressed against her. Her gaze stopped on the wedding photos on the mantelpiece. Their smiles, frozen in time, seemed to remind her of who they had once been. Would he have loved her the same way if he'd known the thoughts that plagued her? When Brandon returned, Julia had already made her decision to carefully test the soil. She greeted him with her usual warmth, but inside her heart was beating so hard it seemed he could hear the rhythm. At dinner, setting aside her fork, she gathered her wits. "Brandon," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, though her palms were sweating. "Do you think people sometimes need time to themselves? To sort out their thoughts?" Brandon frowned, his eyebrows shifting slightly. "What do you mean?" Julia shrugged, trying to speak as casually as she could, though an uneasy feeling clenched inside her. "I don't know. Just hypothetically, if a person needs space to reinvent themselves, should their partner support that?" Brandon chuckled quietly, shaking his head. "I guess it depends on the circumstances. But in a marriage, people decide things together, don't they?" His answer pierced her chest with an unpleasant stab of guilt. She faked a slight smile and nodded, but there was a storm raging inside. It had been a week. Julia couldn't hold back any longer. Zara's words echoed in her head like a relentless call, and she rehearsed what she wanted to say over and over again. That night, after dinner, she asked Brandon to sit down in the living room. Her heart pounded frantically as she poured wine into glasses, her hands trembling faintly. "Brandon," she began, her voice low but firm. "I need to talk to you. It's important." Brendan set his glass down on the table, a flicker of concern in his eyes. "Sure, what's wrong?" Julia took a deep breath, gathering her resolve. "I've been thinking a lot lately, about us, about myself, and I've realized there's something I need to do." Brandon tilted his head slightly, his face a look of bewilderment. "What do you want to say?" She froze for a second, the words stuck in her throat. But then Zara's face flashed before her eyes, and with it, the restless feeling of unease that had kept her restless. Julia made up her mind. "I need some time to sort myself out, to make sure I'm not missing something important in my life." There was silence in the room. Brendan stared at her intently, his expression remaining impenetrable. Then he leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. "Am I understanding this right? You're saying you need space?" Julia nodded, feeling her heart racing. "Yes, just for a little while. I need to realize who I am outside of marriage. I love you, Brandon. That hasn't changed. But I have to do this for me." The silence dragged on, seconds stretching into eternity. Finally, Brendan spoke, his voice flat but painful. "What exactly does space mean? I don't understand." Julia faltered, realizing she'd come to the most painful part of the conversation. "It means that maybe I'll try dating other men, just for a little while, just to make sure I'm not missing anything. I promise, Brandon, it won't change the way I feel about you." Her words seemed to hang in the air, a heavy weight settling between them. Brandon's face remained impassive, but his fingers clenched the edge of the couch so hard his knuckles turned white. "Is that what this means? You're asking me to accept your cheating? And just watch you cheat on me with others?" Julia brushed away her tears and nodded timidly. "I know it's hard, but I need your support. This isn't about replacing you with someone else. It's about me, about my self-discovery." Brandon looked at her long and hard, as if searching for some explanation, some excuse, some hint of doubt in her eyes. But Julia endured his gaze, though everything trembled inside. Finally, he exhaled, got up from the couch, and paced the room. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice strained but still restrained. "You want to find yourself by having fun with other men, and I'm just supposed to sit back and take it?" Julia rose to her feet, her hands clenched nervously. "It's not about replacing you, Brandon. It's just that there are parts of me that I've been repressing, and I need to figure out who I really am." Brendan stopped, turned to her, his jaw tense. "What about my peace of mind, Julia? Am I even entitled to feel anything? Or is my role just to watch while you decide what you want?" His words pierced her. Her eyes filled with tears, and she barely audibly whispered, "I don't want to hurt you. I feel like I'm suffocating, Brendan. I need to know who I am outside of our marriage." He didn't answer right away, just stood there, scrutinizing her as if seeing her for the first time. His eyes were a mixture of hurt and disappointment. Finally, he nodded, but not to her, more to himself. "If that's what you really want, I won't get in the way." His voice was almost devoid of emotion. "But don't think it's going to stay the same." Julia felt the ground slipping from under her feet. Brandon stood in front of Julia, his gaze cold, but a fire raging inside. "If you're really going to do this," he continued, crossing his arms over his chest, "then I need to think about what I want too." Julia opened her mouth to object, but he held up a hand to stop her. "No, Julia, you've said it all. Now I have a choice to make." The next morning, she met Zara at their favorite cafe. Her friend was already sitting at a table, casually scrolling through her phone's feed, and her unfailing latte was next to her. When Julia approached, Zara looked up and smiled, as if this conversation was nothing out of the ordinary. "How did it go?" she asked in a light, almost carefree tone, as if it were a routine event. Julia sighed heavily and sank tiredly into the chair opposite. "He took it badly. I knew he would, but he didn't yell, didn't make a scene, just shut down." Zara squeezed her hand gently, trying to be supportive. "It's okay. It's a big blow, and he needs time to process it." Trust me, Julia, he'll get over it. You're doing this for you, and it's the right thing to do. Julia nodded, but there was an uneasy feeling inside her. Brandon's face flashed before her eyes again, the way his eyes had darkened when he'd said he had to rethink his desires too. That same night, she noticed a subtle but meaningful change beginning to show in his demeanor. When he came home, there was not the usual warm smile, not a light kiss on the cheek. He ate in silence at dinner, nodding in response to her attempts to make conversation, but not really engaging in it. After dinner, he grabbed a pillow and blanket, heading for the guest bedroom. I think it's better this way, he said calmly, without any anger. Julia felt a lump rise in her throat, but nodded. If it makes you feel more comfortable. At night, lying in their empty bed, she felt the chasm between them grow. This was what she wanted, what she had asked for. But why did it feel like a weight she wasn't ready to carry? One weekend, Zara called her to a small party at her apartment. You need this, she said, handing Julia a glass of wine. Relax, unwind. Let the evening just flow at its own pace. Julia tried to follow her advice, but her thoughts kept returning to Brandon. She unconsciously checked her phone, expecting him to text, to ask where she was, to at least just show some emotion. But the screen remained blank. At some point, a man approached her, introducing himself as Caleb. He was charming, his gaze beaming with interest, and his smile was soft and inviting. For the first time in a long time, Julia felt a slight thrill, a tingle of attention that was unaccustomed. When she got home late at night, the house was silent. The door to the guest bedroom was closed, and she didn't dare knock. Julia slid into bed, and in her head she could still hear Caleb's voice, his easy laugh, his playful gaze. But as soon as her emotions settled, a deafening sense of guilt came over her. Yes, she'd enjoyed the attention, but at what cost? Just a few feet away from her was Brandon, the one who was now silently dealing with the consequences of her decision. Julia couldn't sleep for a long time, torn between the excitement of newness and the painful realization of what she was losing. Every day, Brandon became more and more distant. He left for work earlier, came back later, avoided long conversations. When they did speak, his tone was polite but cool. There seemed to be an invisible wall between them, and the harder Julia tried to break through it, the farther he drifted away. He's pulling away from me, she confided to Zara during their coffee meeting. I didn't think it would be this complicated. Zara frowned, but her voice remained firm. You have to hang in there, Julia. He's in pain, but he'll get through it. Don't let his reactions throw you off track. Julia nodded, but somewhere inside, doubt had already settled. Was this freedom worth the pain it caused? Their lives had fallen into a strange, strained rhythm, filled with avoidance and superficial conversations devoid of real intimacy. The laughter that had once filled their home and the moments of intimacy that had been an integral part of their marriage were gone, leaving behind only a heavy silence. The space between them was filled with something cold, invisible but tangible. Julia tried to distract herself, to fill the void with something external. She spent more and more time with Zara, joined a local book club, hoping that the passionate conversations and new acquaintances would help dull the sense of disconnect that was only growing wider. But no matter how hard she tried to keep her mind occupied, the void left by Brandon wouldn't let her go. One night, while she was making dinner, Brandon walked into the kitchen, silently opened a refrigerator, and grabbed a bottle of water. His silence was heavier than any spoken word. Brendan, she called out, her voice treacherously shaking. Can we talk? He froze for a second, his hand still on the refrigerator door, but he didn't even turn toward her. What's there to talk about, Julia? There was no anger in his voice, just tiredness. You made your decision. Now I'm just trying to live with it. His words cut her like a knife. I didn't mean to hurt you, she whispered, but Brandon was already walking away, leaving her with this conversation that never happened. But Julia couldn't stop. She still felt like she had to explore the freedom she dreamed of. Zara organized another event, this time a meeting in a fashionable lounge in the city center. This evening, Julia had chosen her outfit especially carefully. She chose a black dress that emphasized her figure, and looking in the mirror, she wondered if Brandon would even notice her absence. The atmosphere in the lounge was lively, music vibrating in the air, glasses clinking merrily. Julia tried to relax, and soon a man approached her. Sean, he introduced himself, smiling a warm, inviting smile. He turned out to be a witty, charming conversationalist. The conversation with him was easy, filled with subtle teasing and compliments that made Julia feel like a different version of herself. Confident, alive, someone she hadn't been in years. "You're not like the others," he said, leaning a little closer. "I'd like to see you again." She hesitated, but that moment of intoxication from the newness, from the flirtation, was too appealing. She gave him her number. The move was both exhilarating and frightening. When Julia returned home, silence greeted her with the same silent aloofness. Light streamed in from under the guest bedroom door. Brandon was there, but she didn't dare peek in. As she slid under the covers, her phone vibrated. "Tonight was amazing. Let's meet again." Julia stared at the screen, her heart thudding in her chest. After a second, she flipped the phone screen down, as if it could hide her guilt. For the first time, she had something she couldn't tell Brandon, and the feeling made it unbearably hard. The next morning, when Julia walked into the kitchen, Brandon was already sitting at the table, with a cup of coffee in one hand and the phone in the other. He looked up, his face impassive. "You're home late," he said calmly. She froze for a moment, but then forced a smile. "Yes, Zara's party had gone on long enough. I'm sorry if I woke you up." Brendan shrugged. "You didn't." He stared at his phone again, but Julia couldn't help but notice the tension in his posture. Something had changed. Her old Brendan, the one who'd loved her blindly and forgiven her everything, was now watching her closely. And she had a feeling he was already 2 steps ahead. The following week, she met up with Sean again. This time over coffee in a quiet, cozy cafe. "You seem complicated," he remarked with a playful smile. Julia laughed nervously. "Why do you think that?" Sean leaned closer, his voice softer, deeper. "You have the whole world in your eyes. It's like you're carrying something heavy, but you're trying to hide it." The words hit the target, tugged at something deep inside. She felt her defenses cracking, and before she knew it, she was telling him things she'd never told anyone about, feeling trapped, about the role she'd imposed on herself, and about how badly she wanted to break free. Sean listened without taking his eyes off her. "You deserve to be happy, Julia," he said finally. "Don't let anyone keep you in a cage." Julia found herself seeing Tyler more and more often, and each time they met, she was stealthily drifting further away from the life she'd once built with Brandon. The tension in their home grew every day, turning Brendan into a shadow, a constant reminder of the promises she had made, promises she was now betraying. One evening, as they once again sat in the living room, surrounded by an oppressive silence, Brendan spoke. "Are you happy, Julia?" The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" He looked at her intently, his voice remaining steady. "Is this what you wanted? Because from what I can see, you don't look happy." "Neither do I." Julia couldn't find anything to say. She stared at her hands, feeling the weight of his words pressing against her chest. The weeks that followed became a chaotic mix of emotions. Her encounters with Tyler continued, filling her with excitement and novelty, but the parallel feeling of things falling apart at home only intensified. One night, coming home from dinner with Tyler, Julia found Brandon in the living room. He was sitting in a chair, calm, even frighteningly collected. "We need to talk," he said, pointing to the seat across from him. Julia felt her heart beat faster, but she obeyed, sitting down across from him. There was something unfamiliar in his gaze. He looked at her, as if he could see right through her, and for the first time in a long time she felt truly exposed. "I've been patient," he began, his voice steady but tired. "I've given you the space you asked for, but I can't live like this anymore, Julia. What's happening now is destroying us." His words hung in the air, pressing their inevitability. Julia tried to find in his face a hint of the man who had once promised to love her no matter what, but the man in front of her was a man driven to the limit. "What are you trying to say?" Her voice was barely audible. Brandon exhaled, but his gaze didn't waver. "I'm saying you need to make up your mind, because I can't exist in this limbo any longer. Either you choose this marriage or we end it all." A chill ran down her spine at those words. For the first time, she realized what her decisions were really worth. She froze, shocked, letting those words echo in her mind. There was no threat in Brandon's voice, only firmness. It wasn't an ultimatum, but a statement of fact she could no longer ignore. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. "Think about it," he said, rising. His face remained calm, but don't take too long to answer. Julia gave him a look, feeling something inside her clench. She wanted freedom, but she suddenly felt the weight of her own decisions. The next morning, she met Zara for coffee. There was uncertainty trembling in her voice as she recounted the conversation with Brandon. "He's making you choose?" Zara interjected, frowning. Julia nodded. "I don't know what to do. I thought this is what I wanted. But now," Zara squeezed her hand. "You shouldn't let guilt rule you, Julia. You've already gone too far. Don't change your mind just because Brandon's uncomfortable. He'll get used to it." But for the first time, Zara's confidence seemed hollow. Her words didn't soothe. They only reinforced her inner turmoil. In the days that followed, Brandon became more and more distant. He didn't ask how her day was going, didn't linger over dinner for conversation. He spent his evenings in the guest room, immersed in work, phone conversations he no longer explained. Julia tried to communicate, but ran into a wall every time. "Are you avoiding me?" she asked one evening as he was going upstairs. He stopped on the stairs and turned around. "I'm just giving you the space you asked for." Bitterness slid into his voice. "Wasn't this what you wanted?" Her tongue stuck to her palate. She couldn't find anything to say. She started spending more time with Tyler, as if trying to escape the tension that filled the house. One evening they were walking along the waterfront. The city lights twinkled on the calm surface of the water, casting soft reflections on the waterfront. Tyler gently took Julia's hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "You look pensive," he said softly, his voice full of softness. Julia sighed heavily, her gaze sliding over the water surface. "It's complicated." Tyler stopped, turning to face her, and shook his head with a slight smile. "How should it be? Life is too short to stay in something that doesn't make you happy." His words seemed meant to comfort her, but instead only increased her inner discord. Happiness suddenly seemed something elusive to her, constantly slipping away no matter what path she chose. One evening when Julia returned home, she found Brandon in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table, a stack of papers in front of him. He looked up at her, his expression impenetrable. "We need to talk," he said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Julia lowered herself gingerly into the seat, her heart clenched in anxious anticipation. "What's going on?" Brandon silently slid the folder toward her. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about us, about what happened, and I've made a decision." Julia opened the folder with a shiver in her fingers, her eyes running over the lines, and her breath caught. The divorce papers were in front of her. "Are you serious?" Her voice was barely audible. Brandon nodded, his gaze remaining steadfast. "I've tried to understand, tried to be patient, but I'm sick of it, Julia. I want to be with someone who wants what I want." The days that followed became a chaotic maelstrom of meetings with lawyers, endless discussions, nervous arguments. The life she had spent so long building was falling apart at an astonishing rate. Friends and colleagues soon began to notice the changes, and rumors of her infidelity spread like wildfire. Zara was the only one who stayed by my side, but even her support was fading. "You're stronger than you look," she said one night as Julia sat in front of her, her hands covering her face. "Don't let it break you." But Julia already felt that she had broken herself. The day of their trial came with frightening calm. Brandon was restrained, his demeanor remaining courteous but detached. Julia, on the other hand, felt like an empty shell, as if her former self had been left behind somewhere. When the judge announced his decision, she glanced furtively at Brandon, hoping to see a glimmer of affection in his eyes, but his face remained impenetrable. At that moment, she realized that their story was truly over. Brandon stood up, holding out his hand to her. "Goodbye, Julia." She put her palm into his, squeezing out with difficulty. "Goodbye, Brandon." Weeks passed, and Julia struggled to adjust to her new reality. The house that used to be filled with Brendan's presence now seemed cold and lifeless. Tyler had disappeared from her life as suddenly as he had entered it, realizing that her soul was torn and he couldn't be the one to glue the pieces back together for her. Julia immersed herself in work, desperately trying to fill the void with things to do, but no amount of busyness could drown out the inner emptiness. Months later, she found herself back on the waterfront where she had once walked with Tyler. The night was quiet, the city lights reflected in the water like frozen memories. She stared wistfully into the distance, going over everything that had happened in her head. She had gotten the freedom she had longed for, but the price had been higher than she could have imagined. Looking at the water surface, she suddenly realized that in her search for herself, she had destroyed not the prison, but the solid foundation on which her happiness had been built. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.